Section 36 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Seascape with Frieze of Girls. Part 3. From that moment I was a new man, who was no longer my grandmother's grandson, and would remember her only when it was time to get up and go, but the brother, for the time being, of the waiters who were going to bring us our dinner. The dose of beer, all the more that of champagne, which at Baalbec I should not have ventured to take in a week, albeit to my calm and lucid consciousness the flavor of those beverages represented a pleasure clearly appreciable, since it was also one that could be easily sacrificed. I now imbibed at a sitting, adding to it a few drops of port wine, too much distracted to be able to taste it, and I gave the violinist who had just been playing the 2 louis which I had been saving up for the last month with a view to buying something. I could not remember what. Several of the waiters, set going among the tables, were flying along at full speed, each carrying on his outstretched palms a dish which it seemed to be the object of this kind of race not to let fall. And in fact the chocolate soufflés arrived at their destinations unspilled. The potatoes à l'anglaise, in spite of the pace which ought to have sent them flying, came arranged as at the start round the Pollock lamb. I noticed one of these servants, very tall, plumed with superb black locks, his face dyed in a tint that suggested rather a certain species of rare birds than a human being, who, running without pause, and one would have said without purpose, from one end of the room to the other, made me think of one of those macaws which fill the big aviaries in zoological gardens with their gorgeous coloring and incomprehensible agitation. Presently the spectacle assumed an order, in my eyes at least, growing at once more noble and more calm. All this dizzy activity became fixed in a quiet harmony. I looked at the round tables whose innumerable assemblage filled the restaurant like so many planets, as planets are represented in old allegorical pictures. Moreover, there seemed to be some irresistibly attractive force at work among these diverse stars, and at each table the diners had eyes only for the tables at which they were not sitting, except perhaps some wealthy amphitryon, who, having managed to secure a famous author, was endeavoring to extract from him, thanks to the magic properties of the turning table, a few unimportant remarks at which the ladies marveled. The harmony of these astral tables did not prevent the incessant revolution of the countless servants, who, because instead of being seated like the diners they were on their feet, performed their evolutions in a more exalted sphere. No doubt they were running, one to fetch the hors d'oeuvre, another to change the wine, or with clean glasses. But despite these special reasons, their perpetual course among the round tables yielded after a time, to the observer, the law of its dizzy but ordered circulation. Seated behind a bank of flowers, 2 horrible cashiers, busy with endless calculations, seemed 2 witches occupied in forecasting by astrological signs the disasters that might from time to time occur in this celestial vault, fashioned according to the scientific conceptions of the Middle Ages. And I rather pitied all the diners, because I felt that for them the round tables were not planets, and that they had not cut through the scheme of things one of those sections which deliver us from the bondage of appearances and enable us to perceive analogies. They thought that they were dining with this or that person, that the dinner would cost roughly so much, and that tomorrow they would begin all over again. And they appeared absolutely unmoved by the progress through their midst of a train of young assistants, having probably at that moment no urgent duty, advanced processionally, bearing rolls of bread in baskets. Some of them, the youngest, stunned by the cuffs which the head waiters administered to them as they passed, fixed melancholy eyes upon a distant dream, and were consoled only if some visitor from the Baalbec Hotel in which they had once been employed, recognizing them, said a few words to them, telling them in person to take away the champagne which was not fit to drink, an order that filled them with pride. I could hear the twinging of my nerves, in which there was a sense of comfort independent of the external objects that might have produced it, a comfort which the least shifting of my body or of my attention was enough to make me feel, just as to a shut eye a slight pressure gives the sensation of color. I had already drunk a good deal of port wine, and if I now asked for more, it was not so much with a view to the comfort which the additional glasses would bring me, as an effect of the comfort produced by the glasses that had gone before. I allowed the music itself to guide to each of its notes my pleasure, which, meekly following, rested on each in turn. If, like one of those chemical industries by means of which are prepared in large quantities bodies which in a state of nature come together only by accident and very rarely, this restaurant at Rivebelle united at one and the same moment more women to tempt me with beckoning vistas of happiness than the hazard of walks and drives would have made me encounter in a year. On the other hand, this music that greeted our ears, arrangements of waltzes, of German operettas, of music-hall songs, all of them quite new to me, was itself like an ethereal resort of pleasure superimposed upon the other, and more intoxicating still. For these tunes, each as individual as a woman, were not keeping, as she would have kept, for some privileged person, the voluptuous secret which they contained. They offered me their secrets, ogled me, came up to me with affected or vulgar movements, accosted me, caressed me as if I had suddenly become more seductive, more powerful, and more rich. I indeed found in these tunes an element of cruelty, because any such thing as a disinterested feeling for beauty, a gleam of intelligence, was unknown to them. For them, physical pleasures alone existed. And they are the most merciless of hells, the most gateless and imprisoning for the jealous wretch to whom they present that pleasure which the woman he loves is enjoying with another, as the only thing that exists in the world for her, who is all the world to him. But while I was humming softly to myself the notes of this tune, and returning its kiss, the pleasure peculiar to itself, which it made me feel, became so dear to me that I would have left my father and mother to follow it through the singular world which it constructed in the invisible, in lines instinct with alternate languor and vivacity. Although such a pleasure as this is not calculated to enhance the value of the person to whom it comes, for it is perceived by him alone, and although, whenever in the course of our life we have failed to attract a woman who has caught sight of us, she could not tell whether at that moment we possessed this inward and subjective felicity, which consequently could in no way have altered the judgment that she passed on us. I felt myself more powerful, almost irresistible. It seemed to me that my love was no longer something unattractive at which people might smile, but had precisely the touching beauty, the seductiveness of this music, itself comparable to a friendly atmosphere in which she whom I loved and I were to meet, suddenly grown intimate. This restaurant was the resort not only of light women, it was frequented also by people in the very best society, who came there for afternoon tea or gave big dinner parties. The tea parties were held in a long gallery, glazed and narrow, shaped like a funnel, which led from the entrance hall to the dining room and was bounded on one side by the garden, from which it was separated, save for a few stone pillars, only by its wall of glass, in which panes would be opened here and there. The result of which, apart from ubiquitous draughts, was sudden and intermittent bursts of sunshine, a dazzling light that made it almost impossible to see the tea drinkers, so that when they were installed there, at tables crowded pair after pair the whole way along the narrow gully, as they were shot with colors at every movement they made in drinking their tea or in greeting one another, you would have called it a reservoir, a stew pond in which the fisherman has collected all his glittering catch, and the fish, half out of water and bathed in sunlight, dazzle the eye as they mirror an ever-changing iridescence. A few hours later, during dinner, which naturally was served in the dining room, the lights would be turned on, although it was still quite light out of doors, so that one saw before one's eyes in the garden, among summer houses glimmering in the twilight, like pale spectres of evening, alleys whose grayish verdure was pierced by the last rays of the setting sun, and from the lamplit room in which we were dining, appeared through the glass no longer, as one would have said of the ladies who had been drinking tea there in the afternoon, along the blue and gold corridor, caught in a glittering and dripping net, but like the vegetation of a pale and green aquarium of gigantic size seen by a supernatural light. People began to rise from table, and if each party, while their dinner lasted, albeit they spent the whole time examining, recognizing, naming the party at the next table, had been held in perfect cohesion about their own, the attractive force that had kept them gravitating round their host of the evening lost its power at the moment when, for coffee, they repaired to the same corridor that had been used for the tea parties. It often happened that in its passage from place to place, some party on the march dropped one or more of its human corpuscles, who, having come under the irresistible attraction of the rival party, detached themselves for a moment from their own, in which their places were taken by ladies or gentlemen who had come across to speak to friends before hurrying off with an, "I really must fly, I'm dining with Monsieur So-and-so." And for the moment you would have been reminded, looking at them, of two separate nosegays that had exchanged a few of their flowers. Then the corridor, too, began to empty. Often, since even after a dinner there was still a little light left outside, they left this long corridor unlighted, and skirted by the trees that overhung it on the other side of the glass, it suggested a pleached alley in a wooded and shady garden. Here and there, in the gloom, a fair diner lingered. As I passed through this corridor one evening on my way out, I saw, sitting among a group of strangers, the beautiful Princess de Luxembourg. I raised my hat without stopping. She remembered me and bowed her head with a smile. In the air, far above her bowed head, but emanating from the movement, rose melodiously a few words addressed to myself, which must have been a somewhat amplified good evening, intended not to stop me, but simply to complete the gesture, to make it a spoken greeting. But her words remained so indistinct, and the sound, which was all that I caught, was prolonged so sweetly, and seemed to me so musical, that it seemed as if among the dim branches of the trees a nightingale had begun to sing. If it so happened that to finish the evening with a party of his friends whom we had met, Saint Loup decided to go on to the casino of a neighboring village, and taking them with him, put me in a carriage by myself, I would urge the driver to go as fast as he possibly could, so that the minutes might pass less slowly which I must spend without having anyone at hand to dispense me from the obligation myself to provide my sensibility, reversing the engine, so to speak, and emerging from the passivity in which I was caught and held as in the teeth of a machine, with those modifications which since my arrival at Rivebelle I had been receiving from other people. The risk of collision with a carriage coming the other way along those lanes, where there was barely room for one, and it was dark as pitch, the insecurity of the soil, crumbling in many places at the cliff's edge, the proximity of its vertical drop to the sea, none of these things exerted on me the slight stimulus that would have been required to bring the vision and the fear of danger within the scope of my reasoning. For just as it is not the desire to become famous, but the habit of being laborious, that enables us to produce a finished work, so it is not the activity of the present moment, but wise reflections from the past that help us to safeguard the future. But if already, before this point, on my arrival at Rivebelle, I had flung irretrievably away from me those crutches of reason and self-control which help our infirmity to follow the right road, if I now found myself the victim of a sort of moral ataxy, the alcohol that I had drunk, by unduly straining my nerves, gave to the minutes as they came a quality, a charm which did not have the result of leaving me more ready, or indeed more resolute to inhibit them, prevent their coming. For while it made me prefer them 1,000 times to anything else in my life, my exaltation made me isolate them from everything else. I was confined to the present, as heroes are or drunkards. Eclipsed for the moment, my past no longer projected before me that shadow of itself which we call our future. Placing the goal of my life no longer in the realization of the dreams of that past, but in die felicity of the present moment, I could see nothing now of what lay beyond it. So that, by a contradiction, which however was only apparent, it was at the very moment in which I was tasting an unfamiliar pleasure, feeling that my life might yet be happy, in which it should have become more precious in my sight, it was at this very moment that, delivered from the anxieties which my life had hitherto contrived to suggest to me, I unhesitatingly abandoned it to the chance of an accident. After all, I was doing no more than concentrate in a single evening the carelessness that, for most men, is diluted throughout their whole existence, in which every day they face, unnecessarily, the dangers of a sea voyage, of a trip in an aeroplane or motor car, when there is waiting for them at home the creature whose life their death would shatter, or when there is still stored in the fragile receptacle of their brain that book the approaching publication of which is their one object now in life. And so, too, in the Rivebelle restaurant, on evenings when we just stayed there after dinner, if anyone had come in with the intention of killing me, as I no longer saw, save in a distant prospect too remote to have any reality, my grandmother, my life to come, the books that I was going to write, as I clung now, body and mind, wholly to the scent of the lady at the next table, the politeness of the waiters, the outline of the waltz that the band was playing, as I was glued to my immediate sensation, with no extension beyond its limits, nor any object other than not to be separated from it, I should have died in and with that sensation. I should have let myself be strangled without offering any resistance, without a movement, a bee drugged with tobacco smoke that had ceased to take any thought for preserving the accumulation of its labors and the hopes of its hive. I ought here to add that this insignificance into which the most serious matters subsided, by contrast with the violence of my exultation, came in the end to include Mademoiselle Simonet and her friends. The enterprise of knowing them seemed to me easy now, but hardly worth the trouble, for my immediate sensation alone, thanks to its extraordinary intensity, to the joy that its slightest modifications, its mere continuity provoked, had any importance for me. All the rest, parents, work, pleasures, girls at Balbec, weighed with me no more than does a flake of foam in a strong wind that will not let it find a resting place, existed no longer save in relation to this internal power. Intoxication makes real for an hour or two a subjective idealism, pure phenomenism. Nothing is left now but appearances. Nothing exists save as a function of our sublime self. This is not to say that a genuine love, if we have one, cannot survive in such conditions. But we feel so unmistakably, as though in a new atmosphere, that unknown pressures have altered the dimensions of that sentiment that we can no longer consider it in the old way. It is indeed still there, and we shall find it, but in a different place, no longer weighing upon us, satisfied by the sensation which the present affords it, a sensation that is sufficient for us, since for what is not actually present we take no thought. Unfortunately, the coefficient which thus alters our values alters them only in the hour of intoxication. The people who had lost all their importance, whom we scattered with our breath like soap bubbles, will tomorrow resume their density. We shall have to try afresh to settle down to work which this evening had ceased to have any significance. A more serious matter still, these mathematics of the morrow, the same as those of yesterday, in whose problems we shall find ourselves inexorably involved. It is they that govern us even in these hours, and we alone are unconscious of their rule. If there should happen to be near us a woman virtuous or inimical, that question so different an hour ago, to know whether we should succeed in finding favor with her, seems to us now a million times easier of solution without having become easier in any respect. For it is only in our own sight, in our own inward sight, that we have altered. And she is as much annoyed with us at this moment as we shall be next day at the thought of our having given 100 francs to the messenger, and for the same reason which in our case has merely been delayed in its operation, namely the absence of intoxication. I knew none of the women who were at Rivebelle, and because they formed a part of my intoxication, just as its reflections form part of a mirror, appeared to me now 1,000 times more to be desired than the less and less existent Mademoiselle Simonet. One of them, young, fair, by herself, with a sad expression on a face framed in a straw hat trimmed with field flowers, gazed at me for a moment with a dreamy air, and struck me as being attractive. Then it was the turn of another, and of a third, finally of a dark one with glowing cheeks. Almost all of them were known, if not to myself, to Saint Loup. He had, in fact, before he made the acquaintance of his present mistress, lived so much in the restricted world of amorous adventure that all the women who would be dining on these evenings at Rivebelle, where many of them had appeared quite by chance, having come to the coast, some to join their lovers, others in the hope of finding fresh lovers there. There was scarcely one that he did not know from having spent, or if not he, one or other of his friends, at least one night in their company. He did not bow to them if they were with men, and they, albeit they looked more at him than at anyone else, for the indifference which he was known to feel towards every woman who was not his actress, gave him in their eyes an exceptional interest, appeared not to know him. But you could hear them whispering, "That's young Saint Loup. It seems he's still quite gone on that girl of his. Got it bad, he has. What a dear boy. I think he's just wonderful. And what style. Some girls do have all the luck, don't they? And he's so nice in every way. I saw a lot of him when I was with Dorleens. They were quite inseparable, those two. He was going the pace that time, but he's given it all up now. She can't complain. She's had a good run of luck, that she can say. And I ask you, what in the world can he see in her? He must be a bit of a chump when all's said and done. She's got feet like boats, whiskers like an American, and her undies are filthy. I can tell you a little shop girl would be ashamed to be seen in her knickers. Do just look at his eyes a moment. You would jump into the fire for a man like that. Hush, don't say a word. He's seen me. Look, he's smiling. Oh, he remembers me all right. Just you mention my name to him and see what he says." Between these girls and him I surprised a glance of mutual understanding. I should have liked him to introduce me to them so that I might ask them for assignations, and they give them to me, even if I had been unable to keep them. For otherwise their appearance would remain for all time devoid in my memory of that part of itself, just as though it had been hidden by a veil which varies in every woman, which we cannot imagine in any woman until we have actually seen it in her, and which is apparent only in the glance that she directs at us, that acquiesces in our desire and promises that it shall be satisfied. And yet, even when thus reduced, their aspect was for me far more than that of women whom I should have known to be virtuous, and it seemed to me not to be, like theirs, flat with nothing behind it, fashioned in one piece with no solidity. It was not, of course, for me what it must be for Saint Loup, who, by an act of memory, beneath the indifference, transparent to him, of the motionless features which affected not to know him, or beneath the dull formality of the greeting that might equally well have been addressed to any one else, could recall, could see, through dishevelled locks, a swooning mouth, a pair of half-closed eyes, a whole silent picture like those that painters, to cheat their visitors' senses, drape with a decent covering. Undoubtedly for me, who felt that nothing of my personality had penetrated the surface of this woman or that, or would be borne by her upon the unknown ways which she would tread through life, those faces remained sealed. But it was quite enough to know that they did open, for them to seem to me of a price which I should not have set on them had they been but precious metals, instead of lockets within which were hidden memories of love. As for Robert, scarcely able to keep in his place at table, concealing beneath a courtier's smile his warrior's thirst for action, when I examined him I could see how closely the vigorous structure of his triangular face must have been modelled on that of his ancestors' faces, a face devised rather for an ardent bowman than for a delicate student. Beneath his fine skin, the bold construction, the feudal architecture were apparent. His head made one think of those old donjon keeps on which the disused battlements are still to be seen, although inside they have been converted into libraries. End of section 36.